In today's episode of the Back in Shape podcast, we're going to be talking all about the exercises you need to avoid if you have a lower lumbar disc injury. This could be a disc bulge, a herniation, or it could be some degenerative disc disease down there as well. But if you're struggling with relapses happening and you're not really getting on top of this, this is going to be the podcast for you. We're going to talk a little bit about, why this is happening first and foremost, and weak lower back disc specifically. But then we're going to try and get into some really pragmatic steps that you can really take to help you better understand how to move forwards. Because let's face it, some exercises are going to be really, really good to help build strength in discs. But if you do them at the wrong time, that's going to create a real problem for you. And other exercises, they're commonly done, but they don't really have a fundamental place in the recovery process for injured discs in the lower back. So it's going to hopefully be very insightful so that you know exactly what you should be doing at each time as you go through, and have a couple of exercises there to talk about, and then also a couple of principles so that you can move forwards for the long term safely and effectively. Because people do, unfortunately, especially with these sorts of injuries, they get caught in a little cycle and they struggle to ever rebuild that strength in their lower back. And they unfortunately have the false expectation, the false belief that their back is weak, or rather their back is always going to be weak. Your back will always be weak if you never do anything to strengthen it. But one of the great things about the human body is we can see examples of people like you, people like me, all over the world. Some, they have a very, very weak back after these injuries. They can't turn around. They can't move inside their own house without getting some real trouble and flare-ups. Others are lifting hundreds of pounds in weight on squats or deadlifts and competing at the highest level on a daily basis, almost, maybe not the competing, but lifting those weights on a daily basis. And their discs are strong, their discs are healthy, their backs are exactly the same, strong and healthy. And the only difference there is that the one group has done something to strengthen and the other group hasn't. Maybe not for lack of trying, but for lack of a successful way to get through these things. And again, with many of the exercises that we talk about, yes, it's important that we're doing the right sort of exercises, but more often than not, people fall foul when they do perhaps the right exercise in the wrong way or progress it at the wrong pace because they don't understand some of the things that we'll talk about in today's episode. So the most important thing that you can take away from this is, if you're thinking, I've got a weak disc, I've got a disc bulge that I've been struggling to recover from, that the only way to rebuild strength in that disc, in those damaged discs, is going to be through resistance-based work, through proper application of resistance to the spine to allow it and the surrounding muscles to get stronger, to allow your resilience to improve over time. Because the body will adapt to the stress and strain that we do or don't put on it. Meaning that if we do not put any strain on our body, it will just kind of erode. We go through life in our younger years as we're developing, going through teenage years, and we're building a good degree of strength and stability. And then for some of us, it just stops as soon as we go into the workplace. And then we're just losing what we've got over the subsequent years of life and the decades. And others do make some good effort to actually build that up. But if you don't use it, you will lose it over time. And it certainly gets to a point where that drop off starts to affect your day-to-day life, your day-to-day mobility, your day-to-day independence. And that can happen earlier on, or it can happen much, much later on in life. And that's kind of up to us on the whole. So let's start out by talking about the early stages of recovery. This is when you've just had a flare-up. And it's worth saying a caveat that over the years, when we've seen patients in clinic and we've got members coming through the program, the overwhelming majority, I would say almost no one that has come through the program or come to visit us in clinic has not done other stuff first. They've done lots of other exercises, they've done lots of other things, they've initially not had the diagnosis of a disc bulge, and then it's diagnosed later, or disc injury or disc herniation, etc. So they've tried lots of things and they haven't worked, and often they're doing the wrong sort of thing. So the very first and most important thing that we want to do is avoid excessive load on the lumbar spine. And that means not carrying things. That means not lifting heavy bags of laundry. That could mean not carrying the shopping, etc. Trying to avoid those things as much as possible. Now, we can't live in a test tube, so we have to do some of that. And that's worth recognizing for what we'll talk about a little bit later on. But trying to avoid unnecessary additional load on the spine. In those early days, that extra load is just going to provoke the discs. It's going to aggravate the area that's trying to heal. And it's just unnecessary. The second thing that we want to avoid, which is very commonly prescribed, is going to be those knee hugs, those child's pose exercises, the cat-cow, the cat-camel, whatever you want to call it. It's those large amplitudes, so moving the joint through a large range of motion through the lower back, so fully bending forwards and then back out again. It's those high amplitude movements that are not helpful for the lumbar spine, even though they're so commonly prescribed. And we will get people say, oh, well, I tried those, they helped my back. They helped your back for a moment when you did them, but they are not helpful for recovering and rebuilding a strong lower back. They just don't have a place in that. And others might disagree, but the overwhelming majority of people have lower back injuries, especially disc injuries that are recurrent and that don't heal very well, or that the patient or you are struggling to get to resolve and get strong again, is because there's too much rounding happening in your lower back on a daily basis. You don't need more of that. Now, that's not to say movement of the spine is necessarily bad. Early on in this particular stage of recovery, actually walking can be helpful within tolerable limits. So we don't walk for the sake of walking until it hurts. We try and figure out how long we can tolerate load on that injured disc and then do shy of that. So if it's 15 minutes and back starts hurting, we're going to only walk for 10-minute periods. And we're obviously going to be doing other exercises that actually are more involved in strengthening the discs, but and adding benefits to our recovery process. But we want to have a little bit of movement, because when you're walking, even with a good core engagement and good posture, there's going to be small undulations in pressure going through the spine. And that's going to be helpful for the recovery process. So we're not against movement per se, but these excessive range of motion movements are not a good idea. They're not helpful. They don't have a place in your lower back recovery. They're just interfering with the recovery process. The final thing that you really need to avoid in this early stage of recovery is going to be the extended bed rest. Now, thankfully, people don't often fall into this trap anymore, but you do still find it occasionally. And the big problem with this is, although it will give you time for healing to take place because your body's trying to heal every day, if you're in bed rest, you're not going to do anything to aggravate it, which makes sense, but you will very, very rapidly lose any semblance of strength that you did have in your core, back, and leg muscles. And that spells disaster when you try and get up out of bed after that 2-week period off. What little strength you did perhaps have that had a protective function from the day-to-day activities, the ways in which you're moving your body, has now been lost. And now you're in a very tricky position because you don't have the strength to partake in daily life activities, and therefore you injure your back at a moment's notice. Just from turning around, you find it flares up moment after moment. You've tried lots of different treatments, they haven't worked. And that's because you've just lost, unfortunately, unwittingly, the strength that you did have, even if it perhaps wasn't enough in the first place. And the back is very, very weak and has very poor protection. And if you're in this trap, unfortunately, it is difficult to get out, but it's possible. You just need a bit of support and guidance to move forwards and start to restore some of those fundamental strengths and controls, which we will kind of get onto in the next section here. So what are we actually going to do in these early stages? Well, one of the important things, exercises, an antidote to daily life, which is the biggest stressor on many in the early stages of recovery, is going to be the towel exercise and keeping your hips nice and mobile. Now, we talk about both of these in other episodes of the podcast in much more detail, but the towel fundamentally is unloading the lumbar spine. It's supporting the natural curve of the lumbar spine so that it can have a resting position like so, rather than a squashed and flattened position, taking pressure off these lower lumbar discs, taking pressure off the ligaments that are being stretched as we flatten the spine out, and taking pressure off the muscles that are tired and overworked because they're constantly being flattened out, as so many people have this reduction in the lumbar lordosis from the myriad of daily tasks that flatten and eliminate that natural lumbar curve, which is essential for appropriate weight bearing. As we eliminate that lumbar curve, we squash down on the discs and make these problems worse. The hip stretching is important. Stretching of the muscles of the hip, the hamstrings, the hip flexors, the glutes. This really does help, but people often fall, especially in this early stage, into a myopic focus on this particular area when actually it's a very, very small part. Main reason being those injuries in the lower lumbar spine coming out of those last two segments, whether it's L4-5 or R5-S1, sends signals to all these muscles, and they're going to tighten back up on a daily basis as long as the injury is active and is quite acute, if that makes sense, or chronic, but flaring up. And so it's very limited in utility doing those, although it is still helpful in part. But sometimes people say, well, I've got to keep stretching. Back off a second, focus on the strengthening work. And you'll find that the stretching gradually, as you go through this process, stretching becomes more and more helpful and a more and more lasting benefit. If you do some stretching and then you go and move around in the lounge or in the kitchen or wherever it may be, and you flare your back up again, all of a sudden those muscles go tight again because of the pain, because of the spasm, because of the signals going down to them, and you're back to square one. It's still worth doing stretching with good form, but you have to understand its actual benefit, and it's minimal in those early days, but still worth doing. The real area that you need to focus is spinal stability. And that is focusing on the ability to control your spine from moving in a way that you haven't authorized it to do so. When you injure your back, say we're talking very much about being around the house at this stage, or maybe activities of daily living, maybe you're out with the dog, whatever it may be, walking the dog. It's when you move in a way that movement leaks into that weak section of the spine and provokes it. That's the real problem. So learning to stabilize the spine so that you can prevent that excess movement occurring at the injured segment, which it's always going to want to. The movement will go through the area that's least limiting it. If your other joints in the lower back and hips are nice and strong, or much stronger, relatively speaking, than an injured segment, which obviously they're going to be, then you're going to find that any movement of the spine in one way or other is going to really focus through that weakest point first, and that's where we fill ourselves up. Whereas if we can learn to stabilize the spine as a unit in the lower back, then we'll find that we can brace that area much, much more effectively through our core muscles. And that can protect us on those from those daily basis activities as we're going through the rest of the healing process. And simple exercises for this include things like the corset engagement and the psoas engagement, which you can do lying down on the floor. They include the modified dead bug and the marching bridge. Both, or all four of those, progressively more challenging, but all very, very safe exercises with significantly less strain on your lower back than many other activities you're already doing on a daily basis. For example, if you're walking the dog and you've got back pain, you're at real risk of the dog going off in one direction or the other. You're already probably picking up after them, going down onto the floor. All of those things are much more challenging than these very simple exercises, but they teach you the fundamentals to start to provide stability so that when we get into the next part, we can really do an awful lot better. But one of the final points before we get into the next section, as you recover, is going to be the mistakes that people make. Now, those four exercises, that I've just mentioned, many of you will try those before. Many of you, if you've done yoga or Pilates, will have tried some of those exercises in some form. But often it's the way, the nuance around how they are taught that makes all the difference. So many times people are taught to do pelvic tucks, to do these exercises, and it's just wrong, and it's not necessary, and it's not applicable to the way in which they should work, and it's not going to help your discs recover effectively. Instead, you need to focus on that neutral spine and providing the engagement, rather than any funny pelvic tucks or anything like that to do whatever exercise it may be, whether it's one of these or some other exercises. You want to make sure you eliminate any pelvic tucks, because that is another big mistake in these early days, and focus on spine stability. Once you can learn how to do that, we can start moving on to weight bearing. And this is kind of that next stage of recovery. Maybe the things are calming down a little bit. You're still in pain, but the reality is you're still living life and you're still moving around the house. You're still getting out of bed in the morning. You're still going to the bathroom. You're still getting in the chair. You're probably even, in many cases, even though the back pain is bad, even though the disc bulge is still really sore, you're still probably getting in and out of the car. All of these activities are complex movements and they are challenging. So we need to take the essence of these exercises and not try and avoid doing them, not try and steer well clear of them. Instead, we want to find real world examples, which I'll get into in a moment. But before we do, the one thing that we do want to avoid here before we've learnt those skills is going to be still to avoid carrying and lifting heavy things. This could be lifting the toddler, it could be carrying the shopping, etc. Why? Because unless we've learnt to maintain that spine stability that we learnt in the first section, in load-bearing movements, the movement that we're doing, if it's bending down, if it's moving in any direction, is likely to leak through, again, the area of the lower back that's injured. So we must try and avoid those things because those will be the sources of flare-ups. And most of the time, it's daily activities where that movement is leaking out and creating our aggravations. But we want to, so what we want to do here is really focus on these three foundational movements. And they are the squat, the hip hinge, and the reverse lunge. Those three movements represent getting up and down out of chairs, the many chairs that you will be sitting on, even the bed when you go to bed every night or get out of bed in the morning. They represent, washing your face, brushing your teeth, doing some things over in front of the sink, as the case may be, to make sure that you're learning to move correctly. The lunge, going up and down stairs, etc. These are real world movements. We don't want to worry about abstract movements that are hardly ever used, but these real world movements make up the basics, and you're already doing those three, chances are, every single day anyway. The problem is you're never thinking about the form. So at this point, you're learning in this early stage to provide that spine stability with these real world movements to start to develop a degree of competence in your squat, your hip hinge, and your reversing lunge. Those movements will steadily make you safer and safer through the day, so you aggravate your back less and less as you go through daily life. And that can again reinforce the healing process by really the absence of silly aggravations that happen during the day, because you're gradually becoming more and more competent. Now, when you're practicing these exercises, you might have some technical flaws. You will, and you will need to learn to do them correctly, but it's best that you do that rather than the alternative, which is not, and still doing those exercises or movements badly every time you get out of a chair, for example. So it's so important that at this stage you get those right, because if you don't get them right and you don't have the spinal control correct, then when you start to add load, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. And some people, unfortunately, maybe they're not in a significant amount of pain. Maybe it's a little bit more chronic-y. It's not quite as acute, quite as debilitating, but it's still there regularly. Sometimes you lapse on your technique and control here, which means that when we start adding resistance on later on, it can really be problematic. So we've got to the point where we're starting to do load bearing exercises. We're doing these squats, these lunges, or reverse lunges, these hip hinges, and we're starting to build a degree of skill, a degree of competence. Now we're looking forwards more to the longer term recovery. And you might still be in pain at this point, and that's okay. You might still have aggravations from time to time as you push things too hard. That's okay. The most important thing we want to do first, though, is avoid lifting unnecessary weights, avoid adding unnecessary weights until we have these real life examples locked in, until we have these real life exercises technically done well with good ranges of motion. And try and avoid externally carrying excess weights. Maybe the shopping. Again, I mentioned the toddler. It could be, a suitcase. It could be a number of different things. Try and avoid still here carrying that excess weight, because we do risk movement starting to leak into the lower back. And that's a really, really important thing that we want to avoid, because that's ultimately going to be the source of many aggravations. But we do want to then, once we've got solid form, we want to steadily and carefully start to add resistance to our exercises. That doesn't mean you go and start doing a bunch of other things. Add the resistance to the exercises that we've just mentioned. Because by steadily increasing the load that we're exposing our lower back to, our discs to, as they continue that recovery and remodeling process, they will get stronger and stronger and stronger. And that is the essence of how we rebuild that strength. Now, there are a few extra tips here to help make sure that you continue this process, because as you start to add resistance to your squat, perhaps your hip hinge, your reverse lunge, maybe you start doing split squats, which are a variation of the reverse lunge, you're going to find that you can push on. And one of the mistakes some people make is that the pain starts to go away. You don't have the pain as much every day. Your body is in a much better position. Your discs are going through that healing process, and people stop doing the exercises, mainly because the pain, the great motivator, has gone. And this is a big mistake, because once the pain is gone, you're actually able to really start to make progress on the rebuilding and the strengthening part. Because much of that is done, the disc is still weaker than it otherwise should be, than its counterparts, but the active pain isn't there, and you still need to go about the strengthening process. It's so easy for us to get derailed, and often it's not a conscious decision. It's just a case of, well, other things came up and I wasn't in pain, so I wasn't limited in going to them, so I started doing those instead. Please avoid stopping too soon. It makes a huge difference, and unfortunately, we get people time and time, they come back to the membership and say, hey, I stopped doing my exercises and it came back. I know I should have carried on, but I'll keep doing them this time, because ultimately you need to build a strong back. And most of that work of building back up the strong back comes in the period where you're not in pain. It comes with the diligence of continuing to do these exercises when you're not in pain. So that's one thing. Now, on the flip side of that is that you sometimes scale a little bit too fast. Some of you that really enjoy working out, you enjoy working out in the gym, maybe at home as well, you're going to scale the resistances a little bit too quickly. And that's where a couple of strategies can really help you, because you have to understand that once maybe you didn't have that bad a technique in the first place, and you've breezed through those early stages that I covered, doing the off weight bearing, spinal stability, and then doing sort of the body weight stuff, and then you're getting back into resistance and using some weights, using some kettlebells, whatever the case may be, barbells, resistance bands, and you might push on a little bit too fast. Well, the thing is that your muscles are going to change really, really quickly, but the disc structures, the cartilage, the ligaments around that section of our spine, they change a lot more slowly, and they require time to develop. And one of the biggest factors at this point is not going to be the movements that you're taking, it's going to be the actual load that's going through your discs. And you might find that you want to really shoot the weights up because you feel like you're able to do it, and then you go too far and boom, you catch yourself out and you go back to square one, or what feels like square one. And that's a mistake that you can avoid. So 2 tips to help you avoid that mistake. Number 1 is go through a period, let's say you're doing it on like a 4 to 6 week rotation. You do a certain weight for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you increase the weight, and then you do it for another 4 to 6 weeks. And that's kind of how you're perhaps moving forwards once you've reached sort of the first plateau, if you will. Spend another 4 to 6 week period. Instead of putting the weight up, work on your range of motion. Try and go lower in those movements. Try and improve your flexibility in those ranges and work deeper sections of the repetition, which means that chances are you're not going to have to increase the weight for that next period. You're just going to work on going lower. That means that your muscles still get new challenges because they're working at different ranges of motion, but your spine isn't being exposed to more load. It's being exposed to the same load, and it can continue to kind of play that catch up while you're working on a slightly different parameter, but still challenging yourself well at the new depth. So that can be one way to kind of delay the rate at which you need to increase the resistances that you're using. The second way is to switch over periodically to single leg work. It might be that you've been focusing a bit more on your squat and on your hip hinge. You want to flip over to doing, say, some reverse lunges and focusing on like a split squat. And that can be a really good tool again. And you could also combine this with working on range of motion as well, because the weight that you're going to be using on that exercise, you might increase it a little bit for the one leg, but compared to what you were doing when you were doing two legs, the load on your spine is going to be slightly lesser. So again, you're able to continue to work the competence of your legs, to continue to work the flexibility of your legs, continue to work the strength of your legs, which is so important for your lower back health. But you're able to grade and slow down the rate at which you're exposing your lumbar spine, the discs that are recovering, to increasing in load. Not to say that you want to stop increasing load, but it's a way of you tapering that process so that the loads that you're exposing your spine to increase at a slower rate than the strain that you're exposing your muscles to. And that can just help dampen the rate at which you increase the load on your spine and give it time to go through that remodeling process, because it's that remodeling process in both the disc and the surrounding structures that is going to really help you build your back and fully recover from this disc injury. So we've covered quite a lot of things here. I thought it'd be nice in today's episode to just kind of run through a little checklist that I've got down here to just help kind of round things off as a few kind of quick fire of what we're going to do to effectively recover from this disc injury in our lower back. Number one is going to be focus on your core off weight bearing. Get that level of spinal control through your lower back and an ability to stabilize the spine without the complexities of load bearing. The next step is going to be taking that control, that neutral spine, that ability to maintain a neutral spine and maintain protection around those discs into the weight-bearing environment. Doing those simple true-to-life activities, exercises in a controlled environment so that hopefully some of that competence can spill over, or it will if you're doing it in a purposeful manner, spill over to competence around the house when you're moving and doing all of those movements anyway. You're just able to instinctively do them better. So if something falls on the floor, you instinctively can go down onto one knee with good form rather than rounding yourself like a fish hook and injuring your back again. You kind of start to develop good habits, and good habits are worth thousands, because they mean that you don't accidentally do silly things. It takes the brain power out of having to move. And although it's a little bit of work to develop the habit of this good movement, it really pays dividends once it's in, and it's hard to break. Habits often are hard to break once they're formed, but it just takes a bit of time to form them. And once you've got competence with form and technique on those load-bearing bodyweight movements, we then start steadily adding resistance and using some of the strategies that I mentioned a moment ago to scale that resistance to make it a little bit more steady and easy for your lower back discs to accommodate. Ultimately, the only way to rebuild your lower back discs is to expose them to load. It needs to be done carefully. It needs to be done sensibly. And if you do need any help with that and you want a little bit of guidance, then we have the program to help you there. And we have tons of resources on the podcast itself to help give you guys a little bit more guidance if you are struggling with lower back pain. Hopefully, this has been a helpful one. If there's anything that you're unsure of, do check out the associated article. And remember, there's always that comment section down there if you do have any specific questions on what we've covered today. Hopefully it's been a helpful one. If you know someone else, as always, that's struggling with their disc injury, maybe you know that they've been going round and round in circles, they've had it for a long time, maybe they've thought they were recovered and then they're not again, then you could consider sharing this particular episode with them. Hopefully it will be a helpful one and maybe help them start to get over that disc injury once and for all. As always, thanks for joining us. If you did find it helpful, give us a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with these weekly releases every Saturday, Sunday, and we will see you in the next episode of the Back in Shape podcast. Thanks for watching.